Fame is not a home. It's a hotel room with bright lights and thin walls. And when the noise fades, you realize how quiet your soul has become. Julianne Moore once said she never believed in happily ever after, only in learning how to stay standing when the lights go out.
The camera flashes have dimmed now. The woman who wants to find elegance in chaos, pain in silence, and beauty in imperfection, sits quietly in her Manhattan apartment, surrounded not by trophies or scripts, but by letters she once wrote to herself, letters she never sent. Julianne Moore, now 64, has lived a life the world calls perfect. An Oscar winner, a timeless beauty, a woman who seemed untouched by scandal. But beneath that composure lies a story that Hollywood never dared to tell, a story of displacement, grief, and a lifelong struggle to feel real in an industry built on illusion. Her tragedy didn't come from a fall from grace. It came from never belonging anywhere at all. In an interview years ago, she confessed something haunting. "I've always felt like an outsider, like I came to life halfway through someone else's story." It was more than metaphor. From a childhood spent moving from one military base to another, to a career built on playing women whose lives quietly fall apart, Julianne's reality blurred with her roles. Every award, every applause came with a deeper loneliness. Behind her luminous smile was a lifetime of impermanence. No home, no roots, no certainty that love or success would stay. Even her most celebrated roles in Still Alice, Far From Heaven, Boogie Nights mirrored her private fears of vanishing into someone else's script. But what the world didn't know was that her on-screen heartbreak wasn't entirely fiction. In private, Julianne endured a series of silent losses, a marriage that ended quietly, a father who died before seeing her greatest triumph, and a mother whose final words would haunt her forever. And yet, through it all, she built a mask of poise so flawless that even those closest to her mistook her pain for grace. Until one day, that mask began to crack. The event that would change everything didn't come with headlines or paparazzi. It came with a phone call and a confession that forced her to face the very thing she had been running from her entire life: herself. Because sometimes the most devastating downfall isn't public scandal, it's the private unraveling of a soul that no longer knows who it truly is. And that is where the hidden tragedy of Julianne Moore begins. Before she was Julianne Moore, she was Julianne Smith, a girl who learned early that stability was a myth. Born in 1960 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, she was the daughter of a paratrooper and a Scottish psychologist. Her father's military career met constant relocation. By the time she turned 16, she had lived in more than 20 different homes. Every move meant a new school, new friends, and the quiet humiliation of being the new kid again. She once said, "You learn to disappear before anyone can reject you." That sentence, simple, unguarded, would later define her craft. She learned to blend in, to read people fast, to become whoever she needed to be. Acting, in a way, wasn't a career she chose, it was a survival instinct. Her mother, Anne, was her emotional anchor, an intelligent, warm woman who told stories with a soft Scottish lilt. But she also carried a quiet sadness, one Julianne never fully understood until later in life. She was homesick her whole life, Julianne once reflected. She never felt settled. The daughter would inherit that same restlessness, the curse of always looking for a place to belong. When she was a teenager, one move particularly shattered her. From Frankfurt, Germany, where she had finally made friends, to a small town in Nebraska. The culture shock was brutal. The confidence she had built vanished overnight. That's when she began spending hours alone, reading, especially the works of the Bronte sisters and Virginia Woolf, women who wrote of longing and isolation. It was in those pages that she first recognized herself, a soul aching for connection, but terrified of permanence. At 17, she found escape in performance. She joined her school's theater club, not because she dreamed of fame, but because the stage was the only place where she could control her own story. Each role gave her permission to be seen without being judged. But her path to acting wasn't glamorous. After high school, she attended Boston University to study theater, working part-time jobs to pay rent. She was shy, often insecure, and terrified she wasn't good enough. Yet her professors noticed something rare, an ability to convey pain without words. "You can't teach that," one of them said. "It comes from somewhere deeper." After graduation, she moved to New York, alone, broke, and invisible. The city was unforgiving. She worked in restaurants, auditioned endlessly, and heard no more times than she could count. But each rejection only deepened her resolve. In those years, she developed her now iconic emotional restraint, the subtle tremor in her voice, the quiet eyes that seemed to hold entire histories. It came from those lonely apartments, from letters she wrote home but never sent, from the ghost of a mother's voice reminding her to stay kind no matter what they say. When she finally chose her stage name, Julianne Moore, combining her two names and her father's middle name, it was symbolic. She wasn't erasing Julianne Smith, she was building armor for her. What no one knew then was that this armor, this calm, graceful exterior, would one day protect her from heartbreak far beyond Hollywood. Because before she ever stepped onto a film set, Julianne had already mastered the hardest role of all, pretending she wasn't lonely.
New York in the early 1980s was a city of noise and hunger, and Julianne Moore was just another face in the crowd, clutching her portfolio, waiting in endless audition lines under the rain. She rented a tiny apartment in Hell's Kitchen, where the walls were so thin she could hear her neighbors arguing through the night. Yet in that anonymity, she was free to fail, to fall apart, to start over. Her first steady job wasn't glamorous, a role in the daytime soap opera As the World Turns. It paid the bills, but more importantly, it forced her to work fast, memorize lines overnight, and perform under pressure. Within a year, she played two different characters, half-sisters, one good and one evil, switching between them sometimes in the same day. It was chaotic, but she thrived. That's where people first noticed her uncanny ability to express contradiction, tenderness and fury, guilt and grace in a single look. When she won a Daytime Emmy in 1988, it was supposed to be a breakthrough, but instead of feeling triumphant, she felt uneasy. "I was terrified that this was all I'd ever be," she later admitted, so she quit. She walked away from stability into uncertainty once again, a pattern that would follow her all her life. For years, she floated between small theater productions and forgettable TV movies, often questioning if she'd made a mistake. But in 1993, everything changed. Director Robert Altman cast her in Shortcuts, and the world suddenly took notice, not just because of her raw, fearless performance, but because of one scene, standing completely exposed, both physically and emotionally, in front of the camera. That scene became infamous, not for shock value, but for honesty. It was Julianne's declaration, "I won't hide anymore." From there, her rise was steady but unconventional. While others chased fame, she chased truth. She gravitated toward characters who were broken but dignified, women who lived in silence until their emotions erupted like storms. Vanya on 42nd Street, Boogie Nights,
Magnolia, The End of the Affair, each film peeled away another layer of her restraint, revealing a woman unafraid to show fragility. But success came with a hidden cost. Directors adored her professionalism, co-stars admired her empathy. Yet behind that discipline was exhaustion, the pressure to stay perfect, the fear that one wrong choice could shatter everything she'd built. In 1999, her role in The End of the Affair earned her an Oscar nomination. That same year, she quietly finalized a divorce from her first husband, stage director John Gould Rubin. The world celebrated her red carpet grace, but no one knew that backstage, she was crying in her dressing room, unsure if she could ever balance love and art again. Julianne once said, "Every role I play is a place to hide." But as fame grew, the hiding places began to vanish. She was now at the doorstep of global stardom, and yet more exposed than ever. And in that paradox of being seen by millions but known by none, the first real crack in her world began to show.
By the early 2000s, Julianne Moore had become more than an actress. She was an emblem of complexity, the face of a new kind of femininity in cinema, fragile yet unyielding, haunted yet graceful. Her performances blurred the line between strength and surrender. Directors began to call her the emotional compass of modern film. The world saw the glamour, the crimson hair glowing under Cannes sunlight, the elegance of her walk at the Oscars, the calm voice that made every interview sound like a confession. But what no one saw was how heavy it all felt. Fame had turned her into an image, and images, as she once said, don't get to rest. Between 1999 and 2002, she delivered one of the most extraordinary streaks in film history: The End of the Affair, Magnolia, Hannibal, The Hours, and Far From Heaven. Each performance was a masterclass in quiet devastation. In Far From Heaven, she played Kathy Whitaker, a 1950s housewife whose perfect life collapses when she discovers her husband's secret and falls for a black gardener. Critics called it the performance of a lifetime. But for Julianne, it was more personal. That character's loneliness, that's something I understood too well, she confessed years later. The film earned her her first Oscar nomination for Best Actress and catapulted her into Hollywood's elite. She was suddenly everywhere: magazine covers, fashion campaigns, interviews that dissected her mystique. But underneath the praise was fatigue. She was a mother now with 2 young children and a second marriage to filmmaker Bart Frundlich. The balance between work and home felt impossible. Her children would later recall that she was always working, always preparing. And Julianne herself admitted, "I've lived many lives, but sometimes I'm not sure which one is mine." The irony was painful. The more she succeeded, the more she lost touch with the person who once just wanted to act, to belong. Her peers noticed it too. Meryl Streep once said of her, "Julianne feels everything. You can see it in her eyes, the ache of carrying too much humanity." Behind the elegance, there was an invisible anxiety, not the kind that breaks careers, but the kind that quietly corrodes the spirit. She worried about fading, about becoming irrelevant in an industry that worships youth and reinvention. In 2006, she returned to the stage in The Vertical Hour, a play about war, trauma, and moral exhaustion. Critics praised her courage for stepping away from Hollywood to do theater again. But those who knew her sensed another reason. She was retreating to find silence. And yet, even in withdrawal, the world didn't let go. Offers kept coming, scripts piled up. She became the face of L'Oreal at 50, a rare honor, but also another layer of perfection to maintain. When she finally won her long-awaited Oscar in 2015 for Still Alice, the audience rose to their feet. She smiled, radiant, grateful. But if you looked closely, there was something bittersweet in her eyes. That role, playing a linguistics professor losing her mind to Alzheimer's, was too close to home. Her mother, Anne, had suffered from mental decline before she died in 2009. Julianne never spoke publicly about it until Still Alice. "It was the first time I could face what I'd lost," she whispered in an interview. That night, the world saw triumph. Julianne felt grief.
She stood there, holding the golden statue, realizing that the greatest validation of her life had come wrapped in the deepest echo of her mother's absence. For once, she didn't feel like celebrating. Because at the peak of her fame, Julianne Moore understood a truth most people spend their lives avoiding. Success doesn't heal you, it only magnifies what's been broken all along.
Fame rarely collapses with a single explosion. It erodes in silence. For Julianne Moore, the erosion began not with scandal or addiction, but with an invisible fatigue that no award could disguise. After Still Alice, she should have been unstoppable. She had everything: critical acclaim, financial security, a loving husband, 2 grounded children. But something shifted. After you get what you've always wanted, she once said, you realize you've built your life around the chase, not the peace. Hollywood began to change around her. Algorithms replaced auteurs. Superhero franchises swallowed adult dramas. And suddenly, her kind of storytelling, intimate, human, fragile, was no longer the industry's obsession. In interviews, she laughed it off. In private, she spiraled. Her agent recalled that Julianne would reject roles for months, terrified of becoming irrelevant, then accept projects she didn't believe in just to stay visible. The woman who once controlled every nuance of her craft began second-guessing everything. For someone whose entire life had been about control over her craft, her emotions, her image, this was unbearable. The anxiety became physical. She lost sleep, stopped eating properly, and retreated into long, solitary walks through Central Park. She was disappearing again, a close friend said, like she used to when she was a child, moving from town to town. That same restlessness returned. And then came the backlash. In 2019, she admitted publicly that she'd been fired from the film Can You Ever Forgive Me?, a role that later won Melissa McCarthy an Oscar nomination. I didn't understand the character the way the director wanted, Julianne said simply. But insiders told a harsher truth. Her perfectionism had become paralysis. She couldn't let go. She overanalyzed, retreated, froze. The humiliation was private but cutting. For someone as respected as Julianne, being replaced was unthinkable. She smiled through it, even joked about it later on talk shows, but those who knew her saw the pain behind her composure. Then not long after, tragedy struck closer to home. Her longtime friend and collaborator, Philip Seymour Hoffman, with whom she'd shared some of her most powerful screen moments, died of an overdose. Julianne didn't speak at his funeral. She simply sat in the back pew, eyes vacant, holding a single white rose. I didn't cry, she said years later. I just stopped for a while. For months, she turned down public appearances. The woman once praised for her emotional openness now avoided eye contact, interviews, even mirrors. It was like watching light slowly drain from her, said a crew member from one of her later films. And yet the most heartbreaking part was not loss, it was invisibility. As Hollywood turned to younger faces, Moore found herself on the sidelines of an industry she had once carried with grace. Scripts grew thinner, characters less complex. It's like they want you to fade quietly, she told The Guardian. But I'm still here. I'm just not sure who's listening. What the public saw was still elegance, film premieres, red carpet smiles, brand endorsements. But beneath it, Julianne was confronting the one enemy she couldn't outact: time. Her reflection had changed. Her phone stopped ringing as much. And yet when she looked back on her early dreams, the longing for belonging, for visibility, she realized the cruel irony. She had become famous enough to be remembered, but too human to be understood. And as her world grew quieter, she began to ask herself the question she had avoided all her life. Who am I when the applause stops? It didn't happen all at once, not with a scandal, not with a breakdown, but with a slow, imperceptible unraveling. Julianne Moore had spent her life embodying women on the edge of collapse. Now, she was quietly living it. It started with her mother's ghost. Anne Love Smith had passed away in 2009, just months before Julianne began shooting The Kids Are All Right.
Her mother's death had been sudden, from an embolism, and Julianne never had the chance to say goodbye. "I was on set when it happened," she once whispered in an interview. "I didn't make it home in time." For years, she avoided confronting that grief, burying it under work, perfection, motherhood. But grief, when ignored, becomes architecture. It builds itself into your bones. And by her early 60s, it began to surface again, in small tremors. Friends noticed the change. She became quieter, less certain, more withdrawn. Her husband, Bart, tried to ground her, but she would drift, physically there, emotionally distant. "I think she was haunted by her mother's unfinished life," said one friend. Julianne had achieved everything her mother dreamed of, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like guilt. Then came the health scare. During a routine checkup in late 2022, doctors discovered a heart irregularity, not life-threatening, but serious enough to require treatment and months of rest. For someone who had built her identity around movement, stillness was unbearable. She hated being told to stop, a close colleague recalled. It wasn't just about the body, it was about losing momentum. She was terrified that if she stopped, the world would move on without her. But in that forced stillness, the memories began to flood back. The childhood loneliness, the endless relocations, the unsent letters, the death she couldn't prevent. And perhaps most painfully, the realization that fame, that glowing, seductive mirage, had stolen something she could never get back: the quiet joy of simply being. In an unrecorded moment, a friend visiting her apartment described finding Julianne sitting on the floor, surrounded by photo albums, pictures of her children, her mother, her early stage days. She wasn't crying, she said. She was just tracing the faces with her fingers, like trying to remember what it felt like to be them. Her greatest tragedy wasn't a fall from grace, it was watching her own reflection age faster than her spirit could catch up. She began turning down roles entirely, saying, "I can't keep pretending to be other people when I still don't understand myself." The industry didn't notice her absence at first, but her silence grew louder. The actress who once embodied the fragility of others had finally confronted her own. And in that fragile acceptance, there was something quietly redemptive. For the first time in decades, Julianne began painting, small watercolors of landscapes and faces, often unfinished. When asked why, she smiled faintly. Because sometimes it's okay not to finish. The woman who had lived her entire life through characters finally found peace in imperfection. And perhaps that is her true tragedy. Not the loss of fame, not the fading spotlight, but the understanding that all along she had been chasing connection in a world built to keep her at a distance. A woman who gave her soul to cinema and learned, too late, that the applause can never replace the sound of a loved one's voice.
Julianne Moore's legacy is not one of scandal or collapse. It is one of quiet endurance, the kind that rarely makes headlines but leaves a mark in the hearts of those who have ever felt unseen. Even now, at 64, she remains one of the few actors whose presence can silence a room without raising her voice. Her performances, whether in Far From Heaven, The Hours, or Still Alice, are more than roles. They are portraits of human fragility. She never glorified pain. She translated it, made it understandable. Her peers speak of her with reverence. Kate Blanchett once said, "Julianne doesn't act emotions, she inhabits them. You see her break without hearing a sound." Directors like Todd Haynes and Paul Thomas Anderson credit her with redefining what it means to play a woman on screen.
not as an archetype, but as a living contradiction. But her greatest contribution may be off-screen. Julianne became a mentor to young actresses, not by lecturing, but by listening. When asked what advice she gives newcomers, she said softly, "Never confuse visibility with worth. They will see you when they need you. You must see yourself the rest of the time." That sentence, spoken without fanfare, encapsulates the philosophy she earned through decades of survival in an industry obsessed with appearances. She's also become a quiet advocate for authenticity. She rejects the term age-defying, calling it an insult disguised as praise. Instead, she speaks openly about aging, vulnerability, and impermanence, the very things Hollywood teaches its women to hide. "I don't want to look younger," she told the Sunday Times. "I just want to be present." Her husband, Bart Frundlich, once said, "Julianne's tragedy is also her gift. She feels everything too deeply, and that's what the world sees as beauty." When asked if she would do it all again, the loneliness, the heartbreak, the endless reinvention, she paused for a long moment before replying, "Yes, because every role taught me how to survive being myself." In the end, her story loops back to where it began, a child searching for belonging in a world that kept moving. Only now, she no longer seeks permanence in people or applause, but in meaning. Her life reminds us that true success is not found in staying on top, but in staying whole. And maybe that's the quiet truth behind her tragedy, that the same heart that carried her through fame, loss, and isolation never hardened. It just kept learning how to stay open even when the world stopped looking. Because when the lights fade and the audience leaves, Julianne Moore is still there, sitting in the soft quiet she once feared, finally at peace with the woman she's become.
Hollywood often mistakes tragedy for spectacle, but Julianne Moore's story proves that the real tragedies happen in silence. They unfold not under flashing cameras, but in the still moments between applause and solitude. Her life reminds us that fame cannot fill the spaces left by loss, and perfection cannot protect the heart from breaking. But there is redemption in endurance, in the courage to keep showing up when the world forgets to watch. Julianne Moore's downfall was never a scandal. It was the slow surrender of a woman who finally stopped performing for approval and started existing for truth. And in that quiet surrender lies her greatest triumph, the art of surviving herself. Behind the glory, where every spotlight hides a shadow.